Pam Bondi's courtroom presence was nothing short of commanding. From the moment she stepped forward, it was clear she wasn't there to simply argue a case. She was there to defend the very principles upon which the judiciary stands. She spoke with the confidence of someone who had spent years navigating the complexities of the legal system, someone who understood that justice wasn't about political games or personal biases, but about upholding the law with unwavering integrity. Her voice carried through the courtroom, unwavering, each word precise and deliberate. She didn't resort to theatrics or emotional appeals. She didn't need to. Instead, she relied on the very thing that had defined her career: facts, logic, and an unshakable commitment to the Constitution. She laid out a case so methodical, so airtight, that there was no room for misinterpretation. She knew the stakes. If certain lines were crossed, it wouldn't just be one ruling at risk. It would be the foundation of an entire system. Judicial independence wasn't just a phrase thrown around in legal circles, it was the bedrock of American democracy. Without it, the courts would become mere tools for personal and political gain, rather than institutions of fairness and law. Bondi wasn't about to let that happen on her watch. Her legal mind worked like a scalpel, cutting through weak arguments with surgical precision. She called out contradictions with the ease of someone who had spent a lifetime dissecting cases and exposing legal loopholes. When an assertion was made that threatened to undermine judicial independence, she didn't just counter it, she dismantled it piece by piece. There was no ambiguity, no hesitation. The Constitution was clear, and she made sure everyone in that courtroom understood it. As she continued, the atmosphere in the room shifted. What had started as a tense standoff quickly turned into a masterclass in legal discipline. Those who had underestimated her soon found themselves scrambling to keep up. She anticipated every counterpoint before it was made, already prepared with precedents and ironclad reasoning that left no room for challenge. The intensity of the moment was palpable. Eyes darted across the courtroom, watching as Bondi took control of the narrative. It wasn't just about winning the argument, it was about setting a precedent that would reverberate far beyond that single courtroom. If unchecked power was allowed to seep into the judiciary, the consequences would be dire. She wasn't going to let that happen. She reminded everyone that the judiciary was not meant to be a weapon, nor a shield for those looking to advance their own agendas. It was meant to be an impartial body that stood apart from politics, dedicated only to the fair application of the law. The moment that balance tipped, the entire legal system would be at risk. Her words weren't just directed at those in the room. They were a message to the American people, a reminder that justice wasn't something to be taken for granted. It had to be defended, even in the face of pressure, even when the path of least resistance seemed tempting. Bondi had built her career on standing firm in moments like these, and she wasn't about to stop now. Each point she made reinforced the gravity of the situation. There was no room for interpretation. What was at stake was crystal clear. If judicial independence was compromised, if decisions were influenced by anything other than the law itself, then every American would feel the effects. This wasn't just about legal professionals or lawmakers. This was about every citizen who depended on the courts to function as they were meant to. As her argument reached its peak, the weight of her words settled over the courtroom. She had made her case, not just convincingly, but decisively. There was no need for embellishment or hyperbole. The truth, when laid out with such clarity, was undeniable. The rule of law had to remain untouchable, no matter the circumstances. Bondi stood firm, her expression unwavering. She had done what she came to do, defend the integrity of the judiciary with the full force of the law behind her. The courtroom was electric with tension, a palpable sense that the situation was about to reach its breaking point. The individual who had taken a stand against the very core principles of judicial independence was unaware of the storm he was about to face. When he made his move, believing his position was unassailable, he couldn't have been more wrong. What he saw as a powerful assertion of control over the proceedings quickly became his downfall, and the sharpness of the response he encountered left him stumbling, trying to regain footing. From the moment he opened his mouth, it became clear that his intentions were not purely legal in nature. His approach was anything but impartial. It was deeply personal and politically charged. This wasn't about the law. This was about exercising power in a way that would undermine the very institution he was supposed to serve. And in doing so, he made the mistake of thinking his authority would go unchallenged. What he failed to understand was that there were those who would not stand idly by while such a fundamental principle was jeopardized. It wasn't just the words that tripped him up, but his complete miscalculation of the environment in which he found himself. The courtroom was a space governed by rules, by reason, by law, not by personal agendas or the exercise of unchecked influence. In this room, there were individuals who understood this better than anyone. They were prepared for a challenge, and when it came, they were ready. The flaw in his strategy lay in his assumption that no one would dare challenge his attempt to stretch the boundaries of his authority. But that's exactly what happened. His actions, which might have been seen as subtle oversteps in the past, were now unmistakable to those who had the power to respond. And respond they did, in a way that made it clear this was not a battle that could be won with bravado or empty assertions. This was a legal matter, and it demanded a legal answer, one that would expose the flaws in his reasoning and make his position untenable. The response was immediate, sharp, and devastatingly effective. It wasn't a simple rebuttal, it was a forceful dismantling of everything he had presented. Every point he made was countered with an authority that left no room for argument. The response wasn't just about refuting his claims, it was about showing, in no uncertain terms, that his approach was fundamentally wrong and harmful to the very system he was supposed to uphold. It wasn't just a legal defeat for him, it was a public one, a devastating blow to his credibility. What made the situation even more striking was the way in which his own reasoning was turned against him. Every argument he put forward to justify his position was meticulously torn apart. The flaws in his logic were exposed so clearly that there was no mistaking them. Where he had thought he was making a decisive move, he had instead opened the door to his own undoing. His words, once full of confidence, now began to ring hollow. The more he spoke, the clearer it became that he had misjudged the situation, and that misjudgment would cost him dearly. At the heart of his downfall was the simple fact that he had overstepped the boundaries of what was acceptable. In a system that relied on checks and balances, any attempt to undermine judicial independence would be met with swift resistance. He had failed to grasp the full weight of that principle, assuming that the legal community would turn a blind eye to his actions. But there were those who would not allow such an overreach to go unchallenged. And when those individuals rose to the occasion, they did so with such precision and force that there was no room for the type of ambiguity that had allowed his position to flourish in the first place. As the exchange unfolded, the contrast between his approach and the response he received could not have been clearer. He had assumed the role of a powerful figure, wielding his influence in a way that disregarded the foundational principles of the judiciary. In doing so, he had placed himself at odds with those who understood the importance of maintaining that independence. And in the end, his actions were exposed for what they were: an overreach, a dangerous attempt to manipulate the very system that was meant to ensure fairness and justice. The courtroom grew quieter as the impact of the response settled in. He had been left with little more than empty rhetoric, stripped of any legal foundation. His earlier bravado had faded, replaced by a growing realization that his position had been dismantled in front of everyone. His credibility had been shattered, and with it, his ability to continue pushing forward with any semblance of legitimacy. The weight of what had just transpired was not lost on anyone in the room. The fact that such a clear and decisive response had come so quickly made it even more apparent how easily his actions could be derailed when subjected to proper scrutiny. His sense of power, so palpable at the beginning, now seemed completely unfounded. What he had assumed was a display of strength had instead been a glaring weakness, exposed for all to see. In the aftermath, he was left to reconsider not only his own actions but the fundamental principles of the system he had tried to manipulate. The reality was that no matter how powerful one might seem, no individual or institution could afford to disregard the foundational tenets of law and fairness. His attempt to bend the judiciary to his will had been swiftly corrected, and the IE lesson was clear. Judicial independence, once threatened, would not go unchallenged. The implications of what transpired in that courtroom went far beyond the individuals directly involved. At the center of the storm was a much larger issue, one that had been simmering for some time, but now stood on the brink of erupting. The consequences of what had happened were not limited to one man or one case. They reached deep into the very structure of the judiciary, casting doubt on the impartiality and the credibility of the legal system at its highest levels. In moments like these, it's easy to focus on the immediate fallout, the dramatic exchange, the heated words, and the apparent defeat of a powerful figure. However, the long-term repercussions were far more profound. At the heart of it all was a question that every citizen, every lawyer, every judge, and every lawmaker had to consider. What happens when the integrity of the judiciary is compromised? What happens when the very body meant to uphold the law is seen as vulnerable to political influence or personal agendas? For years, there had been whispers in the corridors of power, debates in legal circles, and growing concern among the public. Some argued that the judiciary had become too politicized, that decisions were being swayed by outside forces, and that the notion of a neutral, impartial court was becoming a distant memory. Others had insisted that the judiciary remained the final bastion of independence, that judges could rise above the fray of politics and personal interests. But with each passing year, the cracks had become more apparent, and this incident served as a stark reminder of just how fragile that independence could be. And at the epicenter of this fragile system was the individual who held the position of Chief Justice. A figure who had once been revered as a guardian of legal principles and fairness now faced the very real possibility that his own legacy and the future of the judicial system could be forever altered by what had just transpired. For those watching, it became clear that his role in this unfolding drama would not be easily forgotten. How he responded to the growing concerns about judicial independence could very well determine whether the public would continue to trust the courts or begin to view them as mere instruments of political power. The questions surrounding his involvement and whether he would address the mounting concerns about judicial independence were not just about one isolated case or one courtroom exchange. They were about the broader implications for the entire judicial branch. If the judiciary could be influenced by external pressures or skewed by personal interests, then the entire foundation of the legal system was at risk. And that risk was not just theoretical, it was very real, and it was happening before the eyes of the public. In many ways, this moment marked the beginning of a reckoning. The legal community was now forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that their highest court might not be as impartial as they had once believed. The question was no longer just whether the system had been compromised in the past. It was whether it could survive if the erosion of its credibility continued unchecked. The response, or lack thereof, from the Chief Justice would be critical. As the leader of the judicial branch, his actions, or his failure to act, would send a powerful message to both the legal community and the public. Would he stand by the principles that had always defined the judiciary? Would he make it clear that judicial independence could not and would not be swayed by political pressure or personal agendas? Or would he allow the system to become further entangled in the web of partisan influence, risking not only the integrity of the court? The growing concern was palpable, as many began to ask whether the judiciary was truly an independent branch of government or merely an extension of the political power structure. If it could be manipulated or undermined by external forces, how could it continue to fulfill its fundamental role of interpreting the law without fear or favor? How could the American people be assured that their cases, their rights, and their futures would be decided by an impartial and fair system if the courts themselves were subject to the whims of those in power? The failure to act decisively in the face of these challenges would not only undermine the public's faith in the judiciary, but would also have a ripple effect across the entire system of checks and balances that defined the American government. The judiciary, as one of the three pillars of government, had to remain a neutral, independent force. If it was allowed to become anything else, the consequences for American democracy could be catastrophic. For many, the question was simple. Could the Chief Justice rise to the occasion and defend the institution he represented, or would he falter, caught between the pressures of political forces and his own sense of duty? The answer to that question would have a lasting impact on the future of the judiciary, and it was a question that could not be avoided for much longer. As the days passed, the scrutiny only intensified. Legal experts, scholars, and everyday citizens alike began to weigh in on what had happened. Some expressed their concerns openly, while others waited to see how the Chief Justice would respond. The eyes of the nation were on him, and the weight of his next decision was immense. The way he chose to navigate this crisis, whether with clarity and strength or with hesitation and ambiguity, would shape the future of the courts and the public's trust in them. This was no longer just about the actions of one individual, or the immediate consequences of a single legal case. It was about the future of an institution that had stood at the core of American democracy for centuries. If the courts could no longer be trusted to be fair, impartial, and independent, what was left of the rule of law? What was left of the bedrock principles that had governed the country for generations? These were the questions that loomed large in the aftermath, and they were questions that would demand answers sooner rather than later. The significance of what took place in that courtroom extended far beyond the immediate exchange of words. It wasn't just an isolated incident involving two individuals with clashing views. It was a microcosm of a much broader battle. One that involved every citizen, every lawmaker, every judge, and every legal expert in the country. The underlying issue was one of great importance: the fight to preserve the integrity of the judiciary and the principle of judicial independence. This was not a new fight, but it had never felt as urgent as it did in that moment. What happened in that courtroom wasn't simply about one judge's overreach or a single instance of a legal misstep. It was a clear reminder of the delicate balance that the judiciary must maintain in order to function properly. A court system that allows itself to be influenced by political forces or personal agendas ceases to be a court system at all. It becomes a tool of power rather than an instrument of justice. And that realization was something that would resonate long after the case had concluded. The courtroom exchange, though dramatic, was only a symptom of a much deeper issue. Judicial independence was not just an abstract concept, it was something that had to be fiercely protected at all times. The moment that independence was allowed to falter, the entire structure of the legal system was at risk. This was not a theoretical concern, but a very real possibility that could have disastrous consequences for the future of justice. The events unfolding before the eyes of the public served as a powerful reminder that the very principles upon which the legal system was built could be eroded if left unchecked. One of the most striking aspects of what occurred was how quickly the public's attention was drawn to the issue of judicial independence. It wasn't just legal professionals who were watching, it was ordinary citizens, people who understood that the fairness of the courts was something that directly affected their lives. The legal system was something they relied on to ensure that justice was served, that the law was applied fairly, and that the rights of all individuals were protected. When they saw signs that the judiciary might be compromised, the response was swift. People understood that, if left unchallenged, the erosion of judicial independence could have far-reaching consequences for their everyday lives. As the situation played out, the clarity of the message became undeniable. The system of checks and balances that had been designed to protect the American people from the abuse of power depended on a judiciary that remained free from political influence. If the courts were compromised, then all three branches of government, executive, legislative, and judicial, could fall prey to the whims of those in power. And in that scenario, the American people would be left without a fair arbiter to uphold the rule of law. The judiciary was the last line of defense, and its independence was non-negotiable. At the heart of this larger battle was the role that every citizen played in ensuring the integrity of the system. The public wasn't just a passive observer in these events, they were participants. Every time someone cast a vote, every time someone spoke out in defense of their rights, they were affirming their belief in the justice system and its ability to function impartially. The judiciary was not an isolated entity. It was a reflection of the values and principles that underpinned the entire nation. If those values were compromised, then the very foundation of the American experiment was at risk. This moment in the courtroom, then, wasn't just about one legal issue. It was about the future of justice itself. The events were a reminder that, while the judiciary might seem like an abstract institution to some, its role was incredibly personal to everyone. It was about the protection of rights, the delivery of fair trials, and the assurance that the law was applied equally to all, regardless of status or influence. These were not ideals that could be taken for granted. They had to be actively defended. And the message was clear. No one was above the law. No institution, no matter how powerful, could be allowed to undermine the principles of judicial independence. This wasn't just the responsibility of those within the legal community. It was the responsibility of every person who believed in the ideals of fairness and justice. It was a collective fight, one that required everyone to stand vigilant and ready to defend the rule of law. This moment also served as a wake-up call to those who had perhaps grown complacent, assuming that the integrity of the judiciary was a given. The notion that the courts were somehow invulnerable to political or personal influence was being shattered before everyone's eyes. It became apparent that the courts, like any other institution, needed constant safeguarding. There could be no assumption of immunity from corruption or bias. The fight for judicial independence was ongoing, and it was a fight that demanded constant vigilance and engagement. As the case unfolded, it became evident that this was not simply a legal issue, it was a national issue. The battle to preserve the impartiality of the judiciary was something that transcended politics and law. It was about the very foundation of American democracy. The legal system was meant to be a tool for justice, not a weapon for power. And if the public didn't act to protect it, then the system itself could crumble under the weight of its own corruption. In the end, what happened in that courtroom wasn't just about one individual's overreach. It was about the survival of a legal system that served the American people. It was a warning shot, a reminder that the fight for justice required constant vigilance. It was a signal to those in positions of power that they were not invincible, that their actions would be held accountable by the people they were meant to serve. The public's response was not one of passive observation, but of active engagement. The issue of judicial independence wasn't a remote concern for them. It was a daily reality that impacted their lives. And as the issue grew more urgent, they began to understand just how critical it was to protect the fairness and impartiality of the courts. The rule of law was not something to be taken for granted. It had to be defended with every tool at the disposal of a free society. In the wake of this courtroom showdown, the message was undeniably clear. The integrity of the judiciary is not something that can be taken for granted. What transpired was a stark reminder that judicial independence, the very foundation of the rule of law, is fragile and must be guarded with unwavering commitment. The actions and the subsequent response illustrated just how easily the trust placed in the legal system can be shaken when those in power fail to respect its autonomy. It was not just an isolated legal battle, but a defining moment in the larger fight for justice and fairness. This event shed light on an uncomfortable truth, that no one, no matter their position, is immune to scrutiny when they overstep the boundaries set forth by the system. When the judiciary is compromised, the entire framework of governance becomes unstable. The battle to preserve the rule of law isn't confined to the courtroom. It extends to every citizen, every legislator, every lawmaker. The public's role in ensuring the integrity of the system has never been more significant. The health of the judiciary is, in fact, a direct reflection of the nation's commitment to fairness, equality, and justice. As the dust settles, the true lesson remains clear. The fight for judicial independence is far from over. It will require constant vigilance, advocacy, and above all, an unwavering commitment to the principle that the law must be impartial, uninfluenced by political pressure or personal interests. When any institution fails to adhere to these basic tenets, it falls upon those who believe in the integrity of the system to stand firm and demand accountability. What happened was a wake-up call, not just for those in the legal profession, but for the entire nation. It is now up to every individual, every organization, and every institution to ensure that judicial independence is never again treated as a mere abstraction. It must be seen as the cornerstone of democracy, one that requires protection not only from within the legal system, but from external forces that seek to corrupt it. The legacy of what occurred will be defined by how the judiciary and the public respond moving forward. Will the system rise to defend its core principles? Will the actions of a few, however powerful, be allowed to undermine the trust of the many? Only time will tell, but what is certain is that the stakes have never been higher. The actions taken, or not taken, in the aftermath of this event will determine whether the courts remain a beacon of fairness and justice or become another casualty of political manipulation. It is now a defining moment, one that demands action and unwavering resolve to protect the fundamental ideals that form the backbone of the legal system.